Hello everyone. So welcome to my yet another video on editorial analysis. So for this video students, I have selected two articles from the Hindu. So the first article that I've selected is titled Turning to Tradewinds on India UAE Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement students, right? So it says that India last week announced the signing of a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with the UAE, United Arab Emirates, right? Now, students, UAE is already India's third largest trading partner with bilateral trade valued at $59 billion. Students. So we all know that India and UAE are like very strong trading partners. And with this, agreement, they have sort of attempted to further deepen and strengthen this partnership. Now, students, a noteworthy point here is that, because of the pandemic and the recessionary environment in the past few years, we saw that there was a rise of protectionism around the world, students. And what do we mean by that? We mean by that is that, around the world, countries were turning inwards. There was a wave of anti-globalization where countries were raising trade barriers for other country students, right? There was a decline in liberalization, students, trade liberalization, right? We all know the famous US-China trade war. And with that, the other countries also got involved, and there was, retaliatory measures by all the countries, leading to a reduced trade output. But now students, as countries are sort of recovering from that economic downturn, so particularly India students. So now, as it is written here on the slide, that the Free Trade Pact is a tacit acknowledgement that India needs to strengthen its trade ties to boost trade and economic output, students, right? So with this agreement, the two countries would reduce the trade barriers for each other, would try to enhance trade with each other. And obviously, as India would reduce the trade barriers for UAE, it would also get greater access to the UAE markets, right? So this is the whole objective behind this comprehensive economic partnership agreement. Now, while India's exports amounted to about $29 billion in the pre-pandemic fiscal year, the UAE supplied India with $10.9 billion worth of crude oil in that period. So we all know, students, that crude oil is, of course, one of the most important import items, from UAE. So moving on. Now, the article says, students, that the two partners now aim to leverage the free trade deal to lift bilateral merchandise trade to $100 billion over the next 5 years. So over the next 5 years, they want to, take this trade to $100 billion. So currently, if you see, it is valued at about $59 billion. And over the next 5 years, they want to enhance it to $100 billion, students. So even though a fine print or the specific trade, tariff concessions are not spelled out, for India, please note this, students, for India, a range of exports, including textiles and jewelry, are set to benefit from a zero duty regime, students, right? For India, textiles and jewelry is one of the most important export items, not just in UAE, but worldwide. And through this deal, India would benefit from a zero duty regime. Next, students, two-way investment flows and remittances, which is a major source of foreign exchange earnings for India, given the large Indian workforce in the UAE. This would also receive a fillip or a boost, basically. And students, this says, so this is one of the FTAs, free trade agreements, but India has a number of other FTAs also in the pipeline. And with this, India has a fresh opportunity to reset its trade ties with the international community, students. So basically, this is not the only FTA that India is executing. India is planning to execute other FTAs with other countries. So students, another important point here is that India is now looking at, please note this, all of you, India is now looking at bilateral agreements with specific individual countries. Now, what do we mean by bilateral agreements, students? Bilateral agreements are agreements between two countries, right? That's why the name bilateral, as opposed to multilateral, wherein a number of countries are involved. For example, you can say ASEAN is like a multilateral arrangement where you have a number of countries that enter into a FTA. But here it is like a bilateral agreement. So India is looking to forge such a strong, FTAs with other countries and not multilateral agreements. For example, rather than, we all know how India chose to withdraw or not enter into RCEP students, right? Similarly, India is sort of reluctant to enter into the kind of trade agreement or FTA it has with ASEAN. So rather than getting into multilateral agreements, it is now looking at bilateral agreement, students. So basically, it is cherry picking certain countries with which it thinks it can, sort of execute a profitable trade agreement. So we're going to talk about it in a while. We're going to see that why India chose to stay out of RCEP, why it thought that it's not going to be profitable for India. So we're going to talk about that in a while. So basically, India, sees here a fresh opportunity to reset its trade ties with the international community, right, with this FTA. Now, very quickly, students, let's just understand what is CEPA, students, right? So it is Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. So India and UAE have entered into a CEPA. Now, how is that different from a FTA, Free Trade Agreement? So basically, students, CEPA is also a free trade pact wherein countries, mutually decide to sort of lower the trade barriers for each other and reduce it to zero wherever possible. But CEPA, as the name suggests, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. So it is more comprehensive in nature because it not just focuses on lowering the trade barriers, but also look at areas such as trade facilitation, customs cooperation, competition, IPRs, right? So basically, they focus on the regulatory aspects of it. They sort of focus on easing the regulatory aspects so as to enhance or facilitate greater trade between the countries. Now, very quickly, students, what are the benefits? How India stands to benefit from this particular trade pact? So this is India's first in the region, students, first bilateral trade pact in that region, Middle East region, and first comprehensive trade agreement with any country in a decade. Now, this CEPA is likely to benefit about $26 billion worth of Indian products that are currently subjected to 5% import duty, right? And it is expected that CEPA will lead to an increase in bilateral trade from the current $60 billion to $100 billion, as already told to you. And Indian exporters will also get access to the much larger Arab and African markets, right? And 90% of India's exports will have duty-free access to the Emirates, students. And very importantly, this CEPA, students, would generate 10 lakh jobs across labor-intensive sectors such as textiles, gems, jewelry, leather, footwear, pharma, agriculture, medical devices, etc. So we all know, students, India has this large, young population that needs to be employed, gainfully employed students, right? And this is one avenue wherein the employment across the sectors would get enhanced or boosted, because the sectors that stand to gain from increased exports to UAE are mostly labor-intensive sectors such as textile, gems and jewelry, leather, footwear, pharma. These are all labor-intensive sectors, students, right? And once UAE opens up its markets for these sectors, obviously these sectors stand to gain, leading to increased employment generation. And to protect the interest of domestic producers, India has kept certain items out of the trade list, students. So basically, we all know that when a certain country opens up its borders for the products from other countries, so certain industries which are still nascent or not well developed or not strong vis-a-vis foreign competition, their interest gets hurt. So India has identified such industries, for example, dairy, fruit, cereal, vegetable, tea, and these would be kept outside the trade list or the CEPA to protect these industries, right? Now, students, in this context, let's understand that why India chose to sit out of RCEP. So I just now told you that India now has a preference for, bilateral agreements, and it is reluctant to join large trading blocs where several countries are involved, right? So it is pertinent here to understand that why India chose to stay out of the largest trading bloc ever, called Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, students. Now, this is RCEP, students. It is the world's biggest free trade deal signed by 15 Asia Pacific economies in November 2020. So basically, it has got all the, ASEAN countries, plus the countries that ASEAN has free trade agreements with, for example, Japan and Australia and South Korea and Australia. So basically, why did India choose to stay out of it? So number one, students, India feared that, or India was concerned about cheap Chinese imports flooding the Indian market, harming domestic producers. That was one. India already has a trade deficit with China, which is around $53 billion, students, and further reduction and removal of custom tariffs, as it would have been required to do under RCEP had it become a part of RCEP. So that would have led to greater influx of cheaper products from China, students. Also, it's not just about China, but with reference to other countries as well, several ASEAN countries. India runs a negative trade balance, students, runs a trade deficit with those countries, right? And had India been a part of it, India would have, further suffered. Its imports from those countries would have certainly increased, students. And India's experience with the ASEAN and as part of other trading blocs has also shown, students, that it led to, like it is written here, that imports from these countries grew 44%, students, right? And to nearly $75 billion, while exports only increased by 36%, right? In fact, our foreign minister also said that India did not benefit from the ASEAN being part or pursuing a free trade agreement with ASEAN. It led to deindustrialization in India. Our domestic industries were severely harmed by it, right? And therefore, India chose to sit out of it. Then, students, the final reason was high trade barriers in service sector. So India really enjoys, service sector is one of India's biggest strength. However, ASEAN has, so most of the countries of RCEP are like ASEAN countries, right? That's why I am repeatedly talking about ASEAN. So ASEAN countries have very high trade barriers when it comes to service sector. So in any case, India wouldn't have been able to enjoy from, increased trade in the service sector to those countries. So therefore, India chose to stay out of RCEP. Students now quickly understand what are tariff and non-tariff barriers. So I have been repeatedly using these terms that, getting into CEPA or any kind of free trade agreement, India would reduce the tariff barriers. So what are tariff and non-tariff barriers, right? So students, tariff barriers are the tax or duty imposed on the goods which are traded to and from abroad. So basically, tariff barriers, they are like monetary fees or duty or tax which is imposed, right, on the goods which are being traded with other countries. So this is basically to, in a way, discourage the import of goods from other countries, right? Because when you're imposing a tariff or a tax, right? So the countries being imported from abroad, they become expensive. So say a product priced at rupees 100, if it has a tariff of 5%, if a tariff of 5% is imposed on it, it would become expensive by rupees 5, isn't it? So it would be priced at 105. This would make it relatively expensive as compared to the domestic products of that country, making it or rendering it uncompetitive, isn't it? So therefore, tariff barriers are a way to sort of discourage imports from the other countries, or sort of protect the domestic countries from the imports from the foreign countries, right? On the contrary, non-tariff barriers are the obstacles to international trade other than tariff students, right? So basically, non-tariff barriers could take the form of like quota or embargo or sanctions, or other administrative measures. So basically, the other obstacles, the non-monetary obstacles that are raised, right, or the barriers that are imposed on imports from the foreign countries are known as non-tariff barriers. They are non-monetary in nature. They are not in the form of a monetary tax, but other administrative measures. So, for example, say sometimes it could be said that a particular product from a foreign country, you know, uh, does not meet the labeling requirements of a particular country, or have not been produced using hygienic measures. So therefore, a country cannot or would not import it from the foreign country, right? So these are non-tariff barriers. So these are again, in fact, these days, countries sort of use more of non-tariff barriers, because according to the principles of free trade, as propounded by WTO students, countries cannot discriminate the products from other countries or products from two different countries. So industrialized countries, for that matter, use non-tariff barriers to protect the local industries against foreign competition. Now, students, coming to the next article I have chosen for this video, it's titled Russia's NATO problem on the Ukraine war, right? So we all know, students, that Russia has, sort of declared a war on Ukraine, and Ukraine has termed it as a full-fledged invasion and has imposed martial law, in the country. Now, the article says that Russia's unjustifiable incursion into Ukraine following weeks of military troop buildup on their shared border has drastically raised tensions in the region, right? Now, US President Joe Biden and NATO and European Commission leadership, they have imposed several sanctions to Russia. This is, it would overlay, or this is over and above the sanctions that are already imposed on Russia by, US and these bodies. Now, students, the article says that Putin has been hesitant of the idea of engaging diplomatically on the Ukraine question. So we know that, there's been a simmering, sort of tension and Cold War over this whole issue, or between Russia and Ukraine for quite some time now. So the article says that why is Putin not, sort of trying to engage diplomatically on this issue and resolve the issue? And the article says that this is because Putin has certain broader concerns on NATO, which should be answered, right? So basically, why has Putin declared a war on Ukraine? Why it all of a sudden withdrew from the negotiations that were going on, wherein Germany and France were sort of mediating the talks? So why did Putin, suddenly withdraw from that and declared a war on Ukraine? So the article takes the view that it is because, uh, you know, Russia has certain concerns related to NATO and Ukraine's involvement with NATO, right? And unless these concerns are not addressed, Russia will not come to the table, right? To the negotiating table. So, like it's written, that unless Western nations give assurances to Mr. Putin that NATO will not seek to relentlessly expand its footprint eastward, Moscow will have little incentive to return to the negotiating table. Now, students, given this, let's quickly understand what NATO is, because this is at the root of the whole Russia-Ukraine issue. So basically, students, Russia has blamed the NATO, it's called North Atlantic Treaty Organization, for the current crisis, and called the US-led alliance an existential threat to Russia, right? Now, what is NATO, students? It is a military alliance established by the North Atlantic Treaty of April 1949 by the US, Canada, and several Western European nations to provide collective security against the Soviet Union, students, right? So this is the post-World War II, organization. And it is a military alliance, students. And this came into existence given the realities of that time, wherein Soviet Union was, was a tremendous power. And it was an alliance that was formed against Soviet Union by the Western countries, right, led by US. And, a key provision of the treaty, the so-called Article 5 states that if one member of the alliance is attacked in Europe or North America, it is to be considered an attack on all members, right? And this effectively put Western Europe under the nuclear umbrella of the US. Okay, so basically this is a military alliance led by US, right? And there are currently 29 member states. And students, the issue is that NATO is continually, sort of expanding, try to expand its footprint and get, more countries as part of NATO. So this bothers Russia, students. So let's quickly understand Russia's concerns over NATO. So basically, NATO has underwent 5 rounds of enlargement, pulling former Soviet Union countries into its orbit. So we all know earlier we had the Soviet Union with number of countries, and after its disintegration, Russia, was like the biggest nation that emerged with certain smaller nations, and Ukraine is one of those countries. Now, students, Russia recognize after the disintegration, Ukraine emerged as a separate country. Russia till today recognizes the Ukraine rebel regions in the eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, students. These are part of the Donbass region, which is at the center of conflict. Now, Russia recognizes these regions as independent areas. And in fact, Putin declared a war saying that I need to protect the citizens of these separatist regions that want to assert independence from Ukraine, students, right? And Russia has been providing military support to them. Okay. Now, in retaliation to this, Ukraine wants to be a part of the NATO. And US has also been trying to sort of, get more of countries around Russia under its this NATO umbrella, right? So that it can sort of militarize these areas and, it would act as a bulwark against the growing Russian threat. So basically, now there are charges that Ukraine had inherited Russia's historic lands, and after the Soviet collapse was used by the West to contain Russia. It wants Western countries, Russia wants Western countries to guarantee that NATO won't allow Ukraine and other former Soviet countries to join as its members. So basically, Ukraine, to sort of protect itself against Russia, it wants to be a part of NATO. US, on the other hand, and the Western European countries are keen to have more of Soviet Union, erstwhile Soviet Union countries as part of NATO, right? And Russia does not want this. So these are Russia's concern over NATO, students. It has also demanded the alliance halt weapon deployments to Ukraine, and the Western countries have rejected the demand, students, right? Now, students, let's do some vocabulary. Now I've selected, 5 words from the given 2 articles. So the first word is fillip, students. Now, what does the word fillip means? Fillip means something which acts as a stimulus or boost to an activity, right? Something that sort of gives push to something or encourages something or boosts something, that's known as fillip. For example, the reducing of car tax would provide a fillip to the sales. That is, when we reduce the car tax, that would increase the sales. So it would give a fillip to the sales. It would give a boost to the sales, right? Next word, students, accord. Now, what does the word accord mean? It means an agreement, especially between countries, right? And how is it used in this article? So the article says that India has a fresh opportunity to reset its trade ties with the international community, one accord at a time. That means one agreement at a time. That means it should, strike different accords with different countries, and one accord at a time, right? It should progress. That means one agreement. So accord means agreement, students, right? How you can learn this is cord. What is cord? Cord is basically a wire, right? And so agreement, it's like something that is a link. The way a wire is, it's a link between two countries, isn't it? The two countries are connected through that agreement. So accord means agreement. Next, students, remittances, a very popular word. So a very common word. So remittance, students, it's a payment of money that is transferred to another party, right? So it basically like means any kind of a payment that is transferred to another party. However, the popular meaning of the word, right? It is most often used nowadays to describe a sum of money sent by someone working abroad to his or her family back home. So it is mostly used in the context of people sending back their earnings from a foreign country, right, to their country back home, right? So remittance, the way it is used here is two-way investment flows and remittances, a major source of foreign exchange earnings for India, given the large Indian workforce in UAE are also expected to receive a Philip student. So basically, because we have many Indians working in UAE, so they remit back their income, they send back their income, transfer back their income to India, which is known as remittances, right? Moving on, two more words. Then students, next word is reflexive. Now, what does the word reflexive mean? A reflexive reaction or movement occurs immediately in response to something that happens. So it is your immediate response to something, immediate response to some trigger or some stimulus. For example, if you were to touch something really hot, you would immediately, withdraw your hand, right? Or you would immediately drop that object. So that is a reflexive action. It's more like like an immediate response in flash of seconds, more like an involuntary reaction to something. So the way it is used in this article, with the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a reflexive urge to turn inward that was evident in the last 2 years. So I spoke about that protectionist wave, right? That countries were becoming more closed, right? Reducing their trade with other countries, raising trade barriers. So given the recessionary environment and the pandemic situation, so countries had a reflexive urge, that an obvious immediate response to such an economic downturn was to protect their domestic countries from foreign competition and to close their borders from foreign competition. So it was a reflexive urge, immediate response to that situation. And the last word is, students, testimony. Testimony is something that shows that something exists or is true. Another word for proof or evidence, right? So the way it is used in the article, that the accord, the agreement, was finalized in less than 6 months' time from the start of negotiations in September. We're talking about the CEPA between India and UAE. And it says that because it was finalized in such less time, it is a testimony to the strength of the bilateral ties. That means it is a proof of the strong bilateral ties between India and UAE, right? So that's all for this video, students. I'll very soon come up with another video. Thank you so much.